So welcome once again, everyone. Today is the fourth day of the Africa Week 2023 at King's College London at the African Leadership Center and School of Global Affairs, which is themed around the future of polity and practice in Africa. And today we have a very impressive panel of experts on climate change, which I'll return to describe in a minute. In the meantime, feel free to drop in your questions in the question box when the conversation starts. And in about 30 minutes into the conversation, I will be reading out some of those questions when they become available. Today's panel is on climate change and the financing of it, but also the impact of climate change and its interventions on peoples and livelihoods. As we all know, the changing realities on climate change and uniqueness of every region means that African countries must contextualize their approaches to combating climate change within the global landscape, whether through mitigation, adaptation, or compensation for loss and damages. This has meant that various voices on climate change policies should be heard to help shape them into context-relevant policies and practice. Today, we are happy to have three scholars and practitioners who have long years of experience grappling with the way African countries finance and approach climate change interventions, including their impact on livelihoods and well-being. They will help us delve into the impact and importance of the issue of climate change and why it's important to approach it in a particular way relevant to Africa. Welcome today, Dr. Ifesinachi Okafor, Dr. Theo Acheampong, and Rahma Hassan to today's panel. The panel will explore the different strategies adopted in Africa and why these are the best fit or otherwise for sustainable futures in Africa. Now, I'll take a moment to describe the three panelists with us today. So Dr. Ifesinachi Okafor is a lecturer at the University of St. Andrews in the School of Geography and Sustainable Development in Scotland. Her work advances an interdisciplinary understanding of ocean sustainability, governance, and criminality as a question of resource management, environmental justice, and the appropriate effects of depleting marine resources on inequality, poverty, and insecurity. She has extensive field research experience with strategic maritime stakeholders in West and Central African communities. Dr. Okafor has contributed to high-level reports on ocean governance and security, gender and maritime security at the regional and global levels, and published extensively on blue economy, fisheries governance, maritime pollution, and maritime boundary delineations. Dr. Okafor, you had your PhD in leadership, security, and development from King's College London, and so we are happy to have you back. And of course, you have other scholarly qualifications in conflict, security and development and international relations. Happy to have you, and we are hoping that your maritime scope and conversations around coastal communities will help us understand the policies that are relevant to those communities. So welcome. Dr. Theo Acheampong, you too, welcome to today. You are an economist, political risk analyst with over 10 years of experience working on natural resource governance and public finance management issues. You have worked as an independent consultant on various global energy industry projects and provided economic analysis and market research covering frontier emerging markets. Dr. Theo, you specialize in energy policy formulation, taxation, investment analysis, and then extractive fiscal regime design, including investment promotion, finance analysis, and public sector, which is why it's very important that we have you on this to look at the financing of climate change in Africa. Now, Dr. Theo also specializes in business risks in sub-Saharan Africa, which is very important for us. Theo holds a PhD in economics and a Master of Science in petroleum, energy economics, and finance from University of Aberdeen in Scotland, and has a bachelor's degree from Ghana. And then Rahman, you are a PhD fellow at the University of Copenhagen and University of Nairobi. Rahman, you specialize, you are a socioeconomic researcher from Kenya, and you work in social development research in government globally and contextually in the areas of health, gender, and governance. And Rahman, if you all know, audience, is currently in Kenya and researching in community land rights and resilience among pastoralist communities. And Rahma also has a master's degree in sustainable development at the Institute of Development Studies in Nairobi. So welcome everyone, the three of you, and we are hoping that this is going to be a very lively and insightful conversation. Now, the way today's panel will go, in addition to the Q&A questions that will come from the audience, will be that I'll ask a few questions. Feel free to interject anyone, even if the question is directed at a particular person. And let's make it an interactive conversation. At any point, I'll drop in questions from the audience so that we keep the responses relevant to everyone here. So I'll start with you, Dr. Theo. Would you want to give us an overview, I mean, based on all your experience in researching and advising policymakers, an overview of the opportunities and challenges of climate change interventions in Africa today?
Okay, good morning, everyone. And once again, pleasure to be here. Actually, it's quite a big question you've asked, and there are different angles to analyze it from. But the key point for me really is that climate is development, and it's a development issue. So it's not just an issue of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but there are consequential impacts on people and livelihoods, as you rightly alluded to in your opening remarks. The challenge, though, is for Africa. When you look at the statistics, and I think the stats are always important to put things in context. This is the continent that has contributed the least to global climate change. In fact, if you went back the last 200 years and you looked at the data and the statistics, the total contribution of Africa to all of the world's greenhouse gas emissions was actually less than 4% as of 2020. But we actually also stand to bear the severest negative consequences of these climate issues. We've seen in the last couple of years issues from drought to rain and cyclones in places on the continent that hitherto were not really exposed, as much. So that's one side. The other side, though, is the deep energy poverty on the continent. So although we have contributed the least, if you actually just take our emissions profile and you worked it out on a per capita basis, again, it has barely changed. And that then, despite even the continent's population increasing twofold from 509 million to about 1.1 billion as of 2019. So clearly, we've got issues of high energy poverty, which is also translating into issues of inequality. At the same time, we've contributed the least to these greenhouse gas emissions. But now with the decarbonization drive and the attempt to limit the impact of these greenhouse gases on the environment, the development narrative is that you cannot, use hitherto the polluting forms of energy sources, and you have to chart a new developmental path that really hasn't been fully tested out, even in some of the countries that are championing this. So that's where the contestations really lie, in the sense that if we as a continent have to chart this new pathway and to use less polluting forms of energy, then somebody, one, is got to pay for it. But number two, it's not just about using those less polluting forms of energy. It needs to be connected to a broader developmental narrative and drive, which is about industrialization and which is about creating an ecosystem that creates more jobs and opportunities for our people. Over.
No, that's fabulous. Theo, I mean, one thing I pick from this point is about who would pay for it. In Africa, if Africa has made the least impact on climate change, but is also suffering the brunt of it, you know. That makes me want to ask you a follow-up question on this. If we have to finance this ourselves, or if we have to finance climate change interventions, are African countries in a position to fund it themselves? What would be the risk involved then?
No, no African country is in a position to fund it itself. It's very clear. Largely because of the numbers that are involved. Some of the estimates that I've seen between for the next sort of 10 years, you need almost $3 trillion. If you break it down yearly, that's about 300 billion, right? Dollars. And if you look at the size of even FDI inflows or other investment coming in onto the continent, clearly it's not enough to do that. So it needs to come from multiple sources. The governments themselves can play a role, but you do have the international community and some of the other global funds that would play a role. And again, we also need to make a distinction between the investments coming in that are going into mitigation efforts, and then the investment that will go into things like adaptation and helping communities, survive the effects of the climate change. But the straight answer to your question is that no African country would be able to finance the climate adaptation in of itself and on its own.
Many thanks, Theo. That's very, very helpful. So I come to you then, Dr. Ifesinachi, Okafor-Yarwood. There is, I mean, based on what Theo has said, obviously it means that African countries have to be prepared some way, somehow, to dealing with the occurrence and impact of climate change. And since we probably can't fund it all ourselves, and funding is also constricted, what sectors do you think currently are being prioritized or are receiving the least attention, and what can be done to make sure that Africans are ready and prepared and are actually within the context of global interventions towards mitigation?
Thank you so much for the question, and thank you also, Dr. Theo, for your contribution, because it sort of is going to help me make further points on some of the issues you raised. And to start with, how prepared are the African continent, or is the African continent in general? I feel that the fact that there are so many countries makes it quite difficult to sort of put all of them together. As a result, the level of preparedness would vary depending on the country and the issue that they face or the challenge that they want to prioritize. But what I can say for sure is that they are more reactive than preventative in their responses. So it's like, oh, we've just met this and we need to address it, rather than maybe mitigating and trying to avoid some of the things. So we see the example in the way that drought is being addressed, for instance. And then also when we look at the ocean, which is the area that I specialize, we also see things like, despite the fact that research has shown that unless fisheries governance, for instance, is improved on the continent, that a lot of countries in West Africa are going to lose up to half of their fisheries production by 2050. And this is, that's by taking into account that already, when you look at countries like Nigeria to Senegal that make up West and Central Africa or the Gulf of Guinea, about 50% of the fisheries resources in their water is already depleted. So if this is the case now, and if the statistics is right for now, unless you improve your governance, things would get worse. Because, for instance, for Nigeria, by 2050, their fisheries production will reduce by 53%. For Cote d'Ivoire is 56%, and for Ghana is up to 60%. And so, what are they then trying to do differently to ensure that this is not the case? Well, it will appear, because every government wants money and revenue, that they continue to sort of have this position of directly or indirectly allowing for the overexploitation of their resources by signing new agreements, for instance, despite the fact that certain species that is part of this agreement are already depleted and therefore should be allowed to be regenerated, or signing, giving licenses to vessels that they cannot monitor their activities, which then allows for the overexploitation of fish stock. And then when we then look at oil producing countries, for instance, like Nigeria, Ghana, Equatorial Guinea, Angola, and so many other countries, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal will be starting soon, we see that the regulations sometimes give room for oil companies to behave anyhow. And so this, of course, exacerbates the depletion and exacerbates the impact of climate change, which, of course, manifests in depletion. So from that perspective, I could say that the fisheries sector or the ocean sector is one that has for so long been neglected. You could say because it's not visible. You know, the land-centric nature of a lot of the problems that the continent face, be it in relation to civil war, coups, insurgency, have meant that there's so much focus on issues related to land, on issues related to migration, for instance, things that they can see without necessarily looking at the things that happens in the ocean, and then failing to understand that what happens in the ocean has severe implication for what happens at sea. So on to round up, I will say that the level of preparedness varies. The sector that is mostly neglected is the oceans. I would say this because, again, this is the area that I'm more familiar with. Are they doing much? Unfortunately, to a large extent, the focus seems to be, again, economic growth, which is almost the same narrative at the global community where countries want more money. And even though we speak the idea or the intention of mitigating the impact of climate change, when push comes to shove, the question is, how do we run our countries? How do we generate revenue? And this is what so many countries are doing. And this doesn't, I mean, African countries are not excused from it. But then taking idea from what Theo said, it then means that they don't have the wherewithal in terms of the financial capability to actually do these things themselves alone. And then the financial and technological know-how is something that they cannot practically do without support of the global community. And so perhaps this is also something to consider in talking about the extent to which, or the failure of select countries on the continent to address the potential impact of climate change when it comes to the oceans.
This is brilliant, Ife. So I'll be coming to you in a moment, Rahman, but I just wanted to pin this down a little bit further. I mean, obviously, from what you both have said, Theo and Ife, climate change intervention is not just a question of making investment, like spending money, but also changing lifestyles, like changing things, the status quo. Who are the stakeholders within? Because I mean, I hear you say that it's going to be expensive. We can't fund it ourselves, but some of it could be, just domestic, localized policy changes to lifestyles. Are there local stakeholders that we need to watch out for? Who could be the key to, the challenges? Any of you happy to jump in if you want?
Yeah, I'm happy to take a quick stab at this. I mean, before I even come on the stakeholder thing, Efe makes an important point about the fixation by, in my view, African governments on economic growth. But we should actually be questioning the quality of that growth, because I've sat in many forums and I interact with a lot of policy makers, and everyone keeps talking about GDP and inflation and monetary policy, etc. But you don't see a deeper conversation around the inequality that that growth is creating and the depletion of the environment and the whole entire sort of ecosystem, sometimes at our own expense. And Efe is very right. You go into the seas in many a West African country, and you have trawlers from all sorts of places depleting the fish stock. And this is where it ties into the issue of the stakeholders. So there are local level stakeholders. I have been involved in projects where you're talking to community groups, you're talking to some development organizations or NGOs who are doing some work on the ground. But unfortunately, there's a big disconnect between the realities of what these guys are doing on the ground and how that filters through to the national level policy making processes in that regard. So, and that needs to be plugged. That needs to be plugged because ultimately, all this big talk about funding and financing needs to trickle down to the people at the grassroots. But if the people at the grassroots are not being consulted and their voices are not filtering through to that development discourse, then it becomes problematic. A quick example, every country and many African countries have produced the document called the Nationally Determined Contributions, the NDCs, which spells out how they're going to reduce their emissions at a sectoral level and also at a sort of national level. But the process of developing these NDCs and the consultations around it, many a time, these community voices don't feature, if any, at all. And then number two, you also see a disconnect between the NDCs, which is the main sort of climate document or policy that they seek to pursue, and the broader development objectives of the country itself. So those two things are quite important to address. Else, we would be here, come back 10 years down the line, even 20 years, and still be discussing the same issue.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much, Theo. If you wanted to make an intervention as well to this point.
Yeah, so I want to sort of continue with what you said instead of talking about how the most important stakeholders, which in the context of fisheries, which is big, and we're focusing on fisheries because of the number of people that it employs on the continent. It provides food security for over 200 million Africans or even more. It's a source of protein for millions of people. And sometimes it's the only source of animal protein consumed by people. As such, you find that a lot of the decisions are made when I've already talked about reactive, but these decisions are not only made, but also imposed on them without necessarily thinking about, so what is the impact of this decision on these people? And without also collaborating with them to think about more practical ways that will be beneficial for everyone. And so sometimes this is the difference between a new policy being instituted and people flouting those laws because you just made this rule without thinking about me. Well, you go back to where you need to go back to, and I continue with what I need to do, because the reality also is that a lot of our governments do not have the not just technological know-how, but in terms of the assets to be able to enforce some of these new regulations that they are instituting. And so it becomes even worse in the end that we can talk about the impact of climate change on people's lives, especially local indigenous communities and local people that rely on fisheries resources or oceans resources generally, but also how they become further disenfranchised because these decisions are made targeting them whilst continuing with the business as usual attitude when it comes with the industrial sector, be it offshore oil exploration, for instance, continuing with giving oil rigs and new exploration contracts or signing new contracts or fisheries agreement with industrial vessels, or even engaging in port infrastructure expansion projects, which is needed, but without thinking about people. And then in the name of climate change, we think about marine protected areas, which is important, but without thinking about the impact on people that have traditionally fished in those areas, without sometimes consulting them or engaging with them. So I think for me, one of the most powerful stakeholders that can help us achieve this vision of the climate, especially in the open sphere, that is not degraded by 2050, for instance, are not almost always included in the conversations. Regulations are made and then imposed on them, which is unfair, unjust, and of course not sustainable. Thank you.
That is fabulous. Thanks so much. So that brings us to the question of how policies are made, and we'll go into the other issues of finances, that's financing a little further. But Rahma, I was just wondering, how do you assess the inclusion or otherwise of like the most affected population in such conversations? Most affected populations, as if you has said, include like coastal communities, and you have done some research, in pastoralist communities in Kenya, for instance. Do you think their voices, how do you assess their inclusion in the first place? If you can give very specific case studies as well, that would be very helpful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Clement, and to colleagues for your inputs. And of course, thinking about how pastoral, marginalized communities, agrarian communities, and others at the coast are assessed in terms of the climate change interventions is important. Of course, the point has been made elsewhere by others about why it's important for us to think about who are the most affected by the climate impacts, so that there are different ways in which these impacts affect different groups. And I wanted to start by saying that I do not know currently of inclusive or integrated frameworks to assess the impacts and damages inflicted on communities, especially those that we work with in the Eastern Horn of Africa, on like pastoralists. And I think this applies for vulnerable groups and agrarian communities, which are dominate most of African communities. But then additionally, the frameworks also, even where they exist, the indicators or what would need to look at fail to incorporate some of those adaptation interventions. So for instance, if the assessments are project-based, like they mostly are in many cases because of the interventions that we see where we work with many non-government interventions, and even where there are governments involved, they do not necessarily link to national systems, so that, or even maybe inspired by vulnerable groups. So you then wonder, from which corner can we assess them? Is it how they're engaged with the national, broader, global systems, or is it something closer to how communities do this themselves? Yet we know communities have organically found ways of doing this on their own over years. But research already is showing that the efforts to include people are not enough, or they are sparse. Some people say they are completely not done. And a case for why maladaptation is common in areas that we work has been made. But then increasingly the effort we're putting in terms of the people, those of us who research in these areas, is to try to think around understanding the challenges and the opportunities to include, so that when they're assessing these interventions, they are better designed. And when people talk about what is just, then they are socially just in many ways. I'll give examples from Kenya, from pieces of work that I've done recently, about how policies, I think this point has been made, about how the disconnect between policy and practice. Government policies, for instance, the Kenyan Community Land Act, and there's momentum, I think, in sub-Saharan Africa to secure communal rights, ensure communities are involved and their land owned communally is safeguarded. We have found evidence now that there's a lot of lack of consultation. The implementation is going on in contraction. So there's a lot of agony in these communities, yet the ravaging drought currently in the Eastern Horn of Africa and the effects of climate change are impacting these communities most. So in a way, we need to look at ways in which, I think the point has been made by one of my Theo about the inclusion of voices, but even adaptation projects that are implemented in these areas. And I'm giving the examples from pastoral communities where I mainly work, that an example of livestock insurance, for instance, it's mainly accessible to wealthy pastoralists. So how can we look at interventions that closely benefit the local people if we have to talk about inclusion? Back to your question, Clement. So inclusion should start from the beginning, including individuals and people. And I think we also need to problematize the idea of what inclusion means in different contexts, because sometimes we say community, pastoral groups, households, and then we miss the point about how difficult it is to look at the most vulnerable in these groups if this blanket ways of understanding inclusion are made global, like in different ways and not harmonized. Yeah, so yeah, of course, just making the point that these groups have different experiences of climate change. I think the same point has been made by my colleague about the fisher communities. So how can that look like? One point about how that would look like. Some people have made the case of co-designing and prioritizing this with local communities. I think that is known to all of us who work in development fields. But then how can locally adaptation experiences be drawn into this broader funding that my colleagues have mentioned, but also broader projects? So it's just thinking at the pathways about how this evidence is generated and operationalized in a way that is inclusive. I would end there, Clement, on that point.
Yeah, many thanks, Rahma. And I think it really touches on the earlier point about who the stakeholders are, what funding models exist, and other things. So maybe we can stay with that point a little bit. And thanks so much with all the points you made about, the non-inclusion. And you've been very definite that, local voices are never included. And even if frameworks exist to bring them in, Rahma, you said, they are not really utilized, those frameworks. But, coming down to the issue of funding, and I think usually funding can be attained even through mobilizing of local entities and stuff. But so if it Dr. Theo, do you think there are any sustainable funding options really available to African countries? And when I talk about funding, I'm thinking about all phases of climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and now we have the compensation for loss and damage. So sustainability in funding, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I think here to answer this properly, it's good to put some numbers out and then some context around it, and then we see where the money has been sort of coming from, right? So how much is climate change costing Africa in the first place? According to some of the numbers that I've seen, between 7 and 15 billion every year. If you put it in GDP terms, that's between 5 and 15% of the annual per capita GDP of the continent. And this is projected to increase to 50 billion USD by 2050. So that's the cost. And then if you look at the financing and the gap, around it, I started off earlier by saying that you need about 300 billion every year, right, over the next 10 years to be able to fully fund the nationally determined contributions that African governments themselves have actually said they would do to meet their bit of the Paris climate agreement. However, when you actually work out the gap between what is required, this 300 billion, and what is actually come in over the last few years, we've actually gotten just about 30 billion a year. So roughly about 12% of what is required is what is coming in. And the president of the African Development Bank, Acheampong actually said, and here I quote him, that Africa is being shortchanged by climate finance. So that's one point, that the volumes are not enough. But then the second point also is that the actual structure of the financing, again, is highly inequitable. What do I mean by that? If you break the flows down, whether mitigation or adaptation or now loss and damage, historically, a lot of these disbursements have come in in the form of loan instruments, right, or debt. And given that many of our countries on the continent are already experiencing debt vulnerabilities, it's just a new form of adding on to these debt issues. There's a recent estimate by the IMF which actually shows that almost 60% of low-income developing countries, and these are many of them are in Africa, are already at risk of or actually in debt distress in that regard. So the two key issues there really is that the amounts are not enough. What has been coming in is just paltry, but even what is coming in is adding on to or creating further debt vulnerabilities on the continent. And when you break that slightly further down again into some additional sort of details, you begin to see, like I said, many of them coming in the form of loans. But what the continent actually need, we need more grant-based concessional financing, especially for the adaptation related side of things. How can that be changed? There are a number of ideas around that, but I think one of the key things really here is to go back to the debt for climate or debt for climate equity swap, where basically countries that are have monies that they have to give to these international development organizations could channel the principal and or the interest into actually investing in climate adaptation within the countries themselves. That's something that is being strongly advocated for currently, and that will go a long way to actually plug some of that gap. The other thing that I've seen countries starting to do, for example, Gabon recently, is to leverage on their the forest resources and basically selling things like carbon credits. And in Gabon's case, they want to raise as much as 2 billion USD. I think about 11 or 10% of their GDP from selling some of these carbon credits to invest in conservation projects and efforts. So that's basically how that architecture looks like, one in terms of the flows, but some more specifics around adding on to more debt and what I think can be done around resolving it.
That's fabulous. Theo, thanks. I mean, that really also brings us really deep into the technicalities of things and, financing in the realm that further takes away, the most affected population, because it becomes a technical conversation, doesn't it? Is there any way that this ever can be a bottom-up conversation in terms of financing, Theo, or anyone else? But maybe Theo, if you want to respond, then anyone else who is happy to continue can do that.
Yeah, quick one. I think the scale of the amounts that are required, even at the community level, are large and big. And so the communities cannot do it in and of by themselves. The point that both Ife and Rahman have actually made is perhaps there are indigenous knowledge, right, about how they build maybe their coastal defense systems and things like that, that then can be incorporated into the design of the new dams and construction techniques. Things like that I can see, but the money to actually implement these, especially adaptation projects at the community level, the communities cannot do it themselves. And rightly, the government must step in. And governments in the NDCs, there are two parts. There's the conditional and non-conditional. Many African governments, if you look at the details, will tell you that a lot of the interventions they want to make to support or to meet their climate targets are all dependent on external or conditional financing.
Okay, that's quite depressing. But so maybe Ife and Rahma, is there any counter argument at all you can make to this kind of very true argument, but still very depressing?
Nope. I absolutely agree with Theo. It's practically impossible, unjust and unfair. In the same way that it's unfair and unjust to expect countries on the continent to bear the brunt without, countries or Western countries contributing to, hence the argument around loss and damages. So they can't even afford it in the first place. And secondly, a lot of people in the coastal communities are marginalizing that they do not have access to financing in the same way that people in the urban areas, for instance, or people in agriculture, livestock and crops, in the same way that they might have such access. So where exactly do you expect them to, have the money to contribute? Although we're seeing within these communities coming together, forming cooperatives and, contributing money to help themselves to mitigate that impact of lack of finance from the central government. But then expecting them to make those contributions and then give to the government to solve the problem, that, it's unjust. And if you're talking about climate justice, this actually becomes a question again to sort of bring it to the discussion. But the point that Theo made around indigenous knowledges and trying to see how we can integrate some of this historical knowledge, is that at least I can speak about the ocean sector. That, for instance, we had communities in Ghana, in Nigeria, and other countries that maybe on a Tuesday, on a Wednesday, they don't go to fish because they say that the gods are baiting, for instance, or they might not historically catch sharks or dolphin or different things because they say they are seen as gods. These marine mammals are seen as gods. But today, on the days that were historically reserved as no fishing zone because the gods are baiting, they see industrial vessels fishing, they see trawlers. So the trawlers are not disturbing the gods, and small boats are not disturbing the gods. And this has been the logic why so many communities have abandoned these, practices, which, although might not have been tied to conservation explicitly, but historically it has helped with conservation, even though their reasons was traditional or linked to something else. And so I think the most important thing we can do is think about how we can look at some of the positive local ecological knowledges. What can we learn from it, and how might we integrate it with government strategies, or you could say Western or scientific knowledge as you know it? How can we integrate it to bring about this integrative approach or integrated approach to, conservation or resolution to different issues, rather than the continuous top-down approach that the child just makes a decision and then come and say, here you go. Thanks.
Sorry, thanks so much, Ife. I can see some questions trickling in already. Rahma, did you want to make any intervention here at all?
Maybe not, but just to say there's one big victory, at least around the loss and damage compensation conversation, which everybody is talking about. So at least just to say if there's any positive thing I could point to. Of course, it takes back to the cycle. How ready are we, the modalities of setting this up? So the conversations are ongoing, but then I think there's a bigger point about how even the lack of this funding that Theo and Ife are mentioning could also lead to diversion of funds from other needy sectors. For example, the humanitarian sector for some of these populations. So there are different ways to look at that, which maybe I don't want to get into. So yeah, thank you.
That's fabulous. And it's really very interesting. And I think we can take this conversation on and have it for the whole day. Before I go to the questions online and we'll begin to wind down, I just wanted us to have that forward-looking thinking around understanding this very well. And I mean, any of you or all of you can respond to this. Are there any areas and key themes that require further research or policy or interventions around energy transitions in Africa? Because I mind you, the future today appears to be energy transitions. You know, we are all transitioning to other things. That's costly. That's also going to disrupt the economies in Africa, obviously. I mean, Nigeria depends substantially on crude oil, for instance. And if you're moving to energy transitions into safer renewable energy, it means, you know, sources of income will dwindle and many things will happen. What do you think as researchers and practitioners we should be focusing our attention on key areas, you know, the key areas that require further research and further reflections? Anyone can start, really, if you want to start. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to make some reflections here about some of the research areas or themes that require further research. And anytime the energy transition conversation comes up, which I don't work on directly, I always wonder from what, transition from what. We are all at different stages in this transition, and some of the people we work with cannot even afford the basic, where you're transiting them from. So sometimes it's a dead end for me. But then questions around social equity are always important for us to think about, so that we could think about more about the benefits and the losses, and even the trade-offs between the different approaches, so that they're more inclusive. I think that's the theme, the recurring theme we are all talking about. Because even in Kenya, the renewable energies, the big renewable energies have come up with different models about how this can work. There's rural electrification programs in many parts, and sometimes there are other different ways. You say pay-as-you-go model, which is difficult to afford for many less privileged communities and some rural dwellers. Sometimes it ends up even making them be more into debts, and people stop paying, and it just doesn't get manageable. But it also raises alarm about the big renewable projects that will be implemented as a result of these transitions. And this brings me back to the questions around land and how other effects other than climate change are pushing these communities away from their sustainable options that they have traditionally. So the issues around enclosures, exclusions, and dispossession that we can also further think about as research areas. And even these new interesting arrangements that are popping up about communities being shareholders, others fronting that communities are equal shareholders in these energy transitions, but maybe just thinking through how equal those are, because indigenous communities need to be protected from these energy transitions. And we also definitely need to think about how we can bridge the energy poverty Theo talked about with these transitions. Yeah.
That's fabulous. Any other thought on the emerging areas that require further research and thinking?
I think, I can add something and say that, there are so many opportunities in the oceans. We haven't even explored it, especially when you think about the subsection or subsector of the blue power generation, wherein tidal energy or wind energy can be, generated. Research has shown that the ocean, or should I say the idea of thermal energy conversion on the African continent dates back up to 1956. But more currently, we're seeing countries like Ghana, interestingly, and South Africa are actually exploiting that direction of actually trying to generate energy through the oceans. But the question, of course, is the idea of the financing and the technology. Whilst we have so much prospect, our technological know-how is sort of at the, I could say, the subsistence level of our ancestors, unfortunately, when it comes to the knowledge of the oceans and what is possible. And so it means that if we bring in the SDGs, partnership for the goals is absolutely important. And our government then need to learn lessons when it comes to, how they have extracted their resources, especially in relation to fossil fuels or hydrocarbon resources, and the kind of vision they are building, whether they want to continue this cycle, should they bring in partners that have this technological know-how? How is this energy going to be extracted and produced on the continent to serve the continent and be beneficial for the continent? Rather than today, where despite the fact that we produce this fossil fuel, we have still over 500 million Africans do not have access to electricity. And therefore, it brings me down to the next questions. Whilst the idea of clean energy or green or blue energy is important for all of us to reflect on, I also think it will be very unjust, unfair, and impractical for the continent to be expected to go at it at the same rate that countries that has already been there, done that, and do now have the money and technological know-how to sort of transition to it. We should not be expected to go at that pace. We should actually be allowed to still, I know the impact is what it is, but in a system that is just, you don't want to further extend people's vulnerability in the name of transition. So the continent should be allowed to continue with the fossil fuel and hydrocarbon extraction if they need to. What if they are also working to transition, rather than say, you have to stop it now, when already we have over 500 million Africans in the current state of things that do not have any access to electricity. So we have to, I think the main thing in this whole process to think about fairness and just system. That something is important to you does not then mean that my own rights and the things that I need to enjoy have to be deprived. We have to find a way to sort of talk through things and ensure that the policies are fair and just. Otherwise, it becomes, it brings loophole for people to sort of act in ways that actually might undermine the security of the state, the region, and to a very large extent, the global security. Thank you.
That's fabulous.
Just-
Yeah, Dr. Theo.
Yeah, just to quickly add to that, I think both Rahma and Ife have talked about the issue of just transitions and the need to understand the different impacts of that for the different stakeholder communities. I have been doing also quite a fair bit of work around the whole industrialization component of the energy transition, and to what extent can African countries, if any, pursue a low carbon development path that still allows them to industrialize at the same time. And there's a buzzword that often is used in the development practice called industries without a smokestack. But I think there's a need to further unpack that and understand how this would look like for the different countries on the continent, both from an energy side, but importantly also now with all of the things around critical minerals and the processing of it and the creation of value chains, right, within the continent, and the relationship between those minerals processing and even things like the AFCT, the Continental Free Trade Area. So is it possible to mine, say copper or cobalt in DRC or Zambia and have it processed maybe in South Africa and manufacture the EV cars or components in Kenya, rather than attempting to do all of it in one place? I think these are very interesting things that we need to further research and unpack, because ultimately, like I said, all of this climate and this energy transition is all about development, and it's about people, and it's about creating, sustainable economies and jobs at the end of the day in that regard.
Okay, now the Q&A is buzzing with questions. Please do take a moment to read through, and I'll be asking you in a moment. But yeah, really, I think in terms of what advice you have for government, that was going to be my next question. But it looks like we've really exhausted those channels. You've said enough about, but based on where you think research should go, maybe your takeaway. If a government official was here, what are you going to tell them in a couple of sentences? Your takeaway for government before we move to the Q&A from the audience. I mean, each of you should, if you want to advise your government or any government in Africa, please do it now.
I think we have said enough. Our governments often know what to do. It's the political will and the commitment to do it. And sometimes the harmony of or synergy of policies Oftentimes, in my experience, you find that different ministries are attempting to solve the same problem, and that creates a lot of, policy incoherence, and it even acts as a drag or a constraint to doing business. A lot of the government, at least from a climate point of view, have laws. They have the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, that are a starting point. The key thing really is, how do you take that NDC and translate it into some sort of development pathway that allows you to meet those two constraints, climate objectives, but create jobs, industrialize, meet your energy or reduce energy poverty, all of that. And that's where I think a lot of our government needs to be going now, including looking for the funding, but funding external and funding domestic, domestic funding that could also be rechanneled from some of our state-owned enterprises, like the national oil companies that can invest into these new renewable energy forms and even help spur the R&D and the innovation that is needed to move from the subsistence level that Ife talked about to one where we actually, industrializing or become industrialized.
Fabulous. Any other advice for government from the rest? And that, thanks so much, Theo. Very, very insightful. Yes, Rahma, I can see you muted yourself.
Yeah, the evidence we find on how governments and development partners interact with these items, topics are depressing for various reasons. But anyway, I may not lack something to say about how this transition governments must think about meeting the current energy needs of different groups, because there are different levels. But then maybe adapting systems approach, I don't know if that is useful or they find it useful, but we cannot fail to say that other quarters people are talking about climate resilient development as a ways of not only looking at the technical aspects, but also understanding the different resources access for different groups and the values and priorities for different groups, so that even technical solutions like large-scale irrigations in arid and semi-arid areas are useful for communities that are practicing pastoralism, which sometimes is not aligned and does not go well for those. So yeah, I will just stop there, because sometimes I think we just need to say a few things to the policymakers, not so many things. Yeah,
100%, few words. I think they understand that better. Ife.
Yeah, so I echo what everyone else have said, but I just wanted to add that, our government, our policymakers and implementers, they should stop throwing the words resilient communities around without actually working to remove the object of vulnerability for the people. And to be able to do this, they need to engage more with the people. So we need you to engage more with the people that actually are affected by some of the policies you're making, because nobody knows the solution to a problem sometimes more than the people experiencing this problem. So we need more collaborative actions. We need more women that are also affected and sidelined when some of these decisions are made, to be integrated into the conversation. We need you to think about more creative ways to help people to bear the impact of climate change that they face today, and more importantly, the potential impact of the policies you're trying to introduce today. Thank you.
That's fabulous. I'm just trying to go through the questions. There are quite a number, by 11. Now, the first question from Chinenya, I think, has been answered, because Theo, you did mention that the trade in carbon and the carbon credit it's already happening in Gabon, and so definitely that's something to look out for. So I think the answer is in the affirmative.
Yeah, and then quickly, South Africa already actually has a carbon tax. Nigeria, Senegal, Botswana, Gabon, they're all implementing carbon tax or some form of emission trading scheme.
Fabulous. Then there's a question from Lenganaden that policymakers have also usually complained that when they try bottom-up approaches, the responses have not been very positive. The people have not responded well. But how do you think that bottom-up approaches can replace top-down approaches? Yes, Ife.
It doesn't need to replace it. We can have this integrated approach where the top down and the bottom up is working together. And to address a specific question, the reason why they are not turning up is that when a person that sells fish, for instance, comes to that meeting, it means that the 3 hours that those meetings they are going to spend at the meeting that they would have spent in the market is lost. So that profit, it tells you even how least powerful they are in terms of the impact of attending that meeting and how it might affect their income. So perhaps the government can also be creative in maybe finding something for them, somehow saying, okay, we have fixed this, you're going to be compensated somehow for this. And sometimes it might not be practical, then they could go through their association, because now we have people actually finding out, communities are finding out that they're able to achieve something as part of cooperatives when they are together and have the united voices. So they can also go through the leadership. You appoint someone from the leadership to come and represent, and then they can go and talk to the people if you cannot afford to pay for their time. And we see this even in our own research. Unless we are practical and are willing to work around their time, nobody, at least in the context of the work that I do, they will not be willing to engage with you per se if it means having to leave their work, because how else do they make ends? So our government should also be thinking about, in the spirit of fairness, when we talk about these things, the reason why communities make noise about being involved is that they are not involved. And then when you want to involve them, you need to also then make a way to ensure that it's not a loss for them, or the meeting is not fixed on a day, and when government, they're likely to fix it on a working day. Fixed on a day that is then going to affect their ability to sell their goods, and you're not compensating them in any way. And at least in terms of the people that I work with in my research, they're getting to the point where they feel that the government is not doing anything, is not for them. So unless you rebuild that trust, you will call so many meetings and nobody will turn up, unless there is a way to sort of ensure that they don't bear the complete loss of spending 4 hours listening to something that would bring no positive outcome for them. Because for some communities, that is where they are now. I hope this helps.
Mhm.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
You want to add something, Hassan?
Yeah, just to quickly add that the comments made by Ife could apply for sedentary communities and those that are easily accessible. And most of these policies that our governments make and want to implement and try to do participation and are meant for those types of people. So how about the massive pieces of land and the arid and semi-arid areas where people are on the move, mobile communities, marginalized groups? What does participation and inclusion look like? And what does that bottom-up approach look like? Has government paid attention to how different that could look like? Have they tried different interventions to try and get the views of these people? Different groups where even women and men cannot sit together under a tree. And sometimes, apart from the practical considerations of how that inclusion is happening, there are broader questions about communities not finding the utility, the usefulness of engaging in this type of conversations when the results are the same or even worse each time. So I think governments and government officials, even in devolved units, need to think about how the interaction with communities and the meanings of what they get out of those meetings, because those are communities that also have a life to lead, and they also they know where to prioritize their efforts. So I think to add to that, that's something that they can think about how are they prioritizing the voices and implementing them, because people won't come every year in and out for a bureaucratic meeting to ban a budget and nothing comes out of those meetings.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Ife and Rahma. This question from Ife, I think 3 questions from Eka. 3 questions have been 3 questions, one has been answered, I think. But the first one, maybe, Theo, if you are still here, I know you wanted to leave at about 11:30, but hopefully you can stay with us a bit longer. Dr. Eka has 3 questions. I think the first one is around illicit financial flows as a way to source for funding for mitigation. I'm not sure whether how you want to respond to that. So, and then the second one was about how we might use the long-established knowledges on climate change could help in policies, and I think we've discussed that already, using indigenous knowledges there. So then the last one is your thoughts about the scope for collective action across global South context to negotiate a more just outcomes. So, I mean, if you want to take that, Theo, those three questions.
I think I can take the first one because we addressed the second and the third. But on the IFF's question, I think you can tie it into the broader issue of corruption on the continent and the extent to which corruption has been a bane to the development effort going around. So yes, to the extent that we can reduce corruption and the motivation to be corrupt, then we can channel some of those funds into climate-related activities. But beyond that, I think it also comes back to an issue really of, do we actually have a proper plan for green growth? Do we have a proper plan in terms of where our countries want to go in the next sort of 20, 30 years? Because you need to start the planning, which then translates into actions. But I'll have to jump off, unfortunately. It's been a brilliant session.
Yeah, thanks so much. Okay. So let's go through the other questions quickly then. So it means Ife and Rahma kindly take the subsequent ones. Gloriana has a question. Have there been discussions regarding climate funding for countries dealing with an influx of climate change refugees? So this is really around climate migration and refugees. You think that's a concern at all around funding? I mean, any of you can take it.
I mean, I can talk about at least, but I don't think this is restricted to climate funding. But there's this EUTF fund, EUTF, I think is the European Union, that relates to migration, is EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa. And they're trying to sort of use it to address the issue of migration or irregular migration. And the idea is to sort of solve the problem at the point, to support those countries at the point. But the way and the decisions around the money spent, it's quite unclear. So we're currently doing research to understand the unintended consequences of EU developmental policies in the Gulf of Guinea and migration, irregular migration from the Gulf of Guinea to Europe. And so there's no explicit mention of climate change in relation to that funding, but the idea is to support the countries where we have more people coming from in the sub-Saharan Africa to this part of the world, to then be able to stop the problem at the base. And so I cannot really answer the question explicitly to say that there is funding available for climate motivated migration, irregular migration. On the continental level, of course, this is something that is being discussed, especially when we look at the links between insurgency and how insurgency, especially in the Sahel, that is motivated by the impact of climate change and the movement of people, is then perhaps getting people radicalized if they don't get the right support that they need when they get to the next point. So, but I can't say explicitly whether, at least in the case of the EUTF or any other available funding, is specifically targeted at climate motivated migration, be it illegal or irregular.
Okay, thanks so much. So I think there are quite a number of questions on climate financing, which we would know them and probably send a response once we touch base again with Theo, since he's the expert on climate finance. So pardon me if we skip through those questions for now, but we will be responding to the questions later. So maybe we can go to this. So the questions on infrastructure development, we can hold them on for now. There's a question from Alexander Ugo. So how can the diaspora contribute to energy transition to sustainable development from an individualistic and collectivist position? So any thought on diaspora contribution to energy transitions at all? those who, like Africans living elsewhere and kind
Yeah.
of thing.
Just a thought that crossed my mind. This is an interesting question that Alexander is asking about how the diaspora can contribute, and just reflecting back at how different the diaspora in different countries have approached both the humanitarian aid and support of different projects. I think this could be an interesting one to pursue. And in an earlier comment about the collective action in the region for the global South voice and even negotiation, I think these are areas that need particular attention, because different countries are definitely in different spaces. And I think a collective way of looking at it, including internally looking at what the resources, so that we diffuse the idea that the funding must come from outside. Of course, it must come from outside because those who have caused the mess must account for this, but also if the funds don't come, I think Africans should not sit and wait. So I just wanted to say that's an interesting one, knowing how other diaspora groups are organized to tackle other challenges that face their countries of origin.
I can also add, at least based on what I know, that diasporans are already sort of arising to this, to the occasion in terms of proffering solution, either through their knowledge. In the context of fisheries, for instance, we know that a lot of the fish that is caught by the fishers and then that is processed and sold by the women go to waste because of poor preservation methods. And in relation to electricity or energy, you know, we don't have, over 500 million people do not have access to electricity. So there are so many diaspora scientists, at least the ones that I know, that actually being very innovative and producing solar-powered refrigerated or freezers, for instance, that is solar-powered, which would mean that given, you know, how sunny the continent is, you could say that there's a lot of room for solar power generation, or to be relied on or relied upon for energy generation. So at least I know of one diasporan that has done this thing, tested it, and is already supplying this thing in Nigeria and trying to, you know, get into other West African countries. Diasporans have a very important role to play, and some of them, through different agencies, are funding innovative solutions to mitigate some of the impact of climate change on the ocean. So they have a role to play, and I think we have to be more organized to ensure that we're actually supporting the right things, and also in the spirit of fairness and justice to ensure that the solutions that we're bringing forward does not cause more harm, because of course it's quite easy to do when those solution is not based on, you know, identifying what the needs are and making sure that those needs actually help the people that miss it.
That's fabulous. I mean, those are very good case studies already that are exemplified. Now there's a question from Daniel, which I think will be interesting. Then he thinks that the AU, African Union, is too silent on a number of things. First of all, the willful negligence of the West in expecting Africa to meet its projected increase in energy demand of 30% compared to global increase of 10%, by reneging on its pledge of 100 billion and insisting on immediately going green, not dirty. And so he thinks, you know, the African Union has probably been complicit there. Then there's also the point about the EU. He said shamelessly, the EU's shameless moratorium on Uganda's oil reserve that frustrates the nation's energy transition away from hydrocarbons. Yeah, so basically the point Daniel is making is that the AU has been too silent or complicit in one way or the other, and he wants answers from you. And I know if you have been doing some work, you and I have been doing some work on the African Union's Vision 2063 and the Africa we want and all that. So in the context of all that, does this make any, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I can start first. The reality is actually that I would say that the African Union, compared to any other union in the world, and I can say this, you know, you can quote me anywhere. They have a lot of beautiful policies, like on paper, it's like they think ahead. And some of their ideas have actually been borrowed by others. They have so many beautifully written policies, be it on the Then at 2063 of the Africa We Want, be it more recently on the BE strategy, or even the idea of human security or migration or transboundary movement of goods and services or illicit trade. They have so many policies, but the problem then is on implementation. You know, agreeing to these things and signing up to it and then enforcing it has become the very biggest challenge. And the fact that the countries are quite individualistic when it comes to agreeing on things. So, for instance, you might want to speak on one voice on a certain issues, but then another country is thinking about, but we need this revenue for this thing. And so that might be one of the reasons why things have not necessarily worked as it should, especially in relation to, you know, the question that's been asked by Daniel in terms of why isn't the African Union doing more? But at the same time, it's not just the African Union or countries on the African continent. I think that there's something about the power dynamics as well. Because if you look at the fact that in 2009, it was first agreed that the biggest polluters would contribute at least up to 100 billion to mitigate the impact of climate change. Since 2013, when they actually started contributing to that money, they have never met the 100 billion target. They have never. And so even if when you include this new idea of loss and damage, the question is, are they also going to pay, or is this another agreement that they are not likely to meet in its entirety? So at the end of the day, the main thing is for countries to think about how can they do things in a way that, one, even as a union, we have to speak as a voice, but at the same time, how might this collective voice affect me? And unfortunately, I would say that COVID unraveled. I mean, it had a lot of impact on so many countries on the African continent, and we have to remember that. And maybe for these reasons, maybe it would have sort of undermined some of the progress that we would have seen, for instance, if countries on the continent want to speak together or more jointly as a voice. I feel also that the different competitions, you know, now we don't need to rely on the West anymore in the way that maybe we needed to 30 years ago. But this is perhaps something that countries on the continent are not doing well. We have China, we have Russia. The fact that we have actually different interests makes it really gives us a chance to be more bold in making our demands. And I feel, at least personally, even from the perspective of the work that I do, this is something that our government are failing to do. They are failing to learn the lessons from the past and then take advantage of the opportunities that having different interests, interested in their resources, rather than one interest as it was the case before, they're not really doing it very well. And I don't know the reason. I don't know if it's because of personal interest. I don't know if it's because of power and the fact that, well, there's still certain power dynamics when we talk about the global politics. So you have to be very careful. We can do more, but at the same time, we have to recognize the limits within our ability to do more. You know, and that's what I can say in terms of trying to explain why perhaps the African Union are not doing more. On paper, they have the right intentions, and this is evidenced by all the strategies and all the policies that they have. I guess we need to do further research to actually find out what exactly is stopping them from going a step further. Is it the power dynamics or is it something else? But there's so much opportunity to do more because we now have so many interests, competing interests. Thank you.
That's fabulous. Rahma, if you want to comment on that, that's fine. But yeah, okay. So I'm still trying to see some of them. I think we've answered. There's the question about. There's a question from Wale that twofold really, and it's really around what can be done to reverse migration, mainly whether reversing migration can be a game changer. You know, I guess the point there is that if there's anything that can, you know, stop climate-induced migration, then can that help us at all in fighting migration? And then there's a second question about climate change and energy transition education. Is it possible to infuse that into school curriculum in Africa? And if that's the case, what levels would be appropriate? You know, primary school, secondary school, tertiary. So maybe that, you know, if you want to touch on migration or integration of climate change to school curriculum, that would be a good conversation to start from. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll leave Ife to make the comment about the migration to build up on her earlier point about the diaspora, but an interesting point about education and how the young among us need to see these things differently for those who are getting into the school curriculum, and how formal and informal systems can enable us to also do the education. But then what education? What is this education that we'll be talking about? And I think someone else in this question box had talked about infusing the science with the indigenous knowledge. I think obviously for obvious reasons, we've been fronting the indigenous knowledge inclusion because of how things have been, the evidence hierarchies, and what has been fronted has been the science, which we all do not contest. We are here using scientific methods to even study indigenous communities. But I think the issue is how we can merge those and gel those two so that it is not one replacing the other, and it is not indigenous knowledge replacing scientific processes, but even thinking further about how indigenous processes and indigenous ways of knowing can even be coded into those scientific processes if they help the policymakers adopt them. But of course, we fall into different clubs when we start coding and even making them different. But the point here is how can those two coexist? And the reason why we are fronting the education that is locally led adaptation, fronting ideas that are more likely to be adopted from the ground is because the scientific ones always look alien. The processes are so far away from the local people's realities. So just to make that connection between the education and the science and indigenous practices. And Ife, you can come in on the migration if you have something.
I think the migration thing is actually a very good question, especially whether the aspirants can do something. I would want to use myself as an example. There are so many times I have thought of, you need to go back. If I found the right opportunities, will I go back? I've had this conversation with myself, with friends, with my family. The reality, however, I feel for so many diasporans, at least thinking about myself and how I can use my knowledge to maybe contribute to the change I would like to see in relation to my field, is the issue of security. You're thinking, how safe will it be? In terms of power, and we talked about energy, what about power supply? How expensive will it be to run your own power? Which is the case for so many people relying on generator, for example. And so these are things and so many questions we have to ask ourselves. And also the question about healthcare, at least personally, there are so many times, and even more recently, thinking about if the opportunity came up, would you go back to walk the talk around some of these issues? If you say that there are things that need to be done, how can you support those that are already doing it on the ground with your knowledge to do it better, or maybe think about a certain way of doing it? And some of the reasons why I haven't necessarily thought about going all in and risking it has been that I haven't had the response to these questions around energy, around security, around healthcare. And I'd like to think that this is also some of the questions a lot of diasporas that are thinking of this and have not made the move might be thinking. So I feel that our government needs to do better in addressing some of the issues, not even for the diasporans, for those on the continent. And when these issues are addressed, the reality is that actually the young people are very innovative. The solution is there. But the problem is the finance and maybe the little support and push and the opportunity to be able to develop some of these ideas is what is stopping them. That we do not need a messiah or someone coming from a different country to come back and do it. We just need to make the environment at home on the continent more conducive for our young people to use their innovative mind to generate some of the solutions that we know that is already on the ground. Personally, I will absolutely go back in a heartbeat if some of the questions I've been asking myself is answered. I hope this helps somehow, but this is really my honest response to that.
Fabulous. Thanks so much. So I think we have just about 4 minutes, and Jackson, your question, Jackson Munya, your questions are on climate finance, so we'll address them later. There's this last point from, we will address them through a written response when we get in touch with Theo. There's this question from Eka, which I think will be a good concluding response, that it's a question about climate justice and, the fact that, trying to address climate challenges in the global north, like the UK, the US, actually exacerbates climate change and its impact in the global south. And you talk about, electric cars, uranium mining for, for nuclear energy kind of thing. And then there's also this, plantation for some energy, renewable energy sources in Africa, which also pull people away from livelihoods and things. So I think the question from Eka is there a conversation about climate justice that we need to push forward harder than we are doing?
So I can try and answer that, and Rahma, I hope you comment, but I would want to say that I think we need to be very honest and not mince words when we're calling some of these things out. Sometimes it might be seen as problematic, but that is exactly what it is in terms of the realities of it. So talking about, for instance, how in trying to mitigate the impact of climate change or be more sustainable of the environment, we have Western governments, such as those in the United States, for instance, or those in Europe, exporting their toxic waste to non-suspecting governments on the African continent, because sometimes these wastes are declared as non-toxic. So we can't just say it's a case of incompetence on our part because we don't have the tools to see what it is or what's there. And we can't just say that it's a case of corruption and so someone has taken the money. But a case of not declaring, the ethics of not declaring what it is to a country that might not have the tools to test and find out what it is. And then exporting electronic waste that are pure waste as reusable electronics. Of course, this is a way of trying to get rid of these things, not in your backyard, but it's okay somewhere else. And if we look at the injustice element of it, so if you do not want to undermine your environment or the physiological health of your people, it is okay to do it to the Africans. And so how are we talking about the fact that there are laws and regulations around this in the case of toxic waste? So there is the Basel Convention on Transboundary Movement of Waste, and the fact that countries that are signatory to this are in breach of these laws. How is it working? Or when it comes to conservation of fisheries, that in the case of EU Common Fisheries Policy, they have this policy that to be able to now help them with conserving their own fisheries resources, they are exporting their overexploitation elsewhere. And unfortunately, many countries in West Africa are victim of this. But then this is where the question of how our government are complicit. You are aware of the impact on overexploitation. You're also aware of the impact of Chinese and South Korean and all the Asian countries overexploitation of your feedstock, including illegally on your people. But you continue to sign agreements, you continue to give licenses, despite not having the wherewithal or having limited capacity to monitor, survey, and control. And so I think we definitely have to have a wider conversation about environmental justice. It is becoming increasingly frustrating, especially when you have to go back to these communities and you hear the same thing over and over again. It becomes really frustrating because communities are becoming over-researched and nothing is coming out of it. So I absolutely agree with you, Dr. Eka. There has to be a greater conversation, and maybe one of the ways of doing this would be centering the voices of the community. So rather than me as this researcher talking about it, I can talk about it briefly, but we can also hear from the horse's mouth. Let them tell us, and thanks to technology, we can do this amazing thing. And maybe somehow we get to the point where people will be ethical enough to say, okay, no, we need to sit back. What can we do differently? And I feel I've said enough anyways. And on this note, thank you so much. I'm sorry I ran over.
No, thank you.
Yeah, go ahead,
Clement. I
Rahma.
think we've hit the top of the hour, and I think Eka's question would open another conversation. So maybe we should link up again and talk about ideas around climate justice. Of course, if the wealthier nations are supposed to be accountable, then I think we also need to think internally. I think for Africa, we have other difficult issues that we are dealing with, including climate change. So that makes it always difficult to have this conversation. The poverty, the destitution, the insecurity in the region. And, when we want to talk about those, that is, and the governance question, which is broader than we can talk about. So that is always prioritized, but it's very great to hear the reflections from Ife about how bold we need to be we attempted to make some suggestions to policymakers and government. I think we don't need to give up on that. And to thank everyone who kept the chat and the questions alive for us to think harder than we had thought. So thank you so much.
Many thanks. Absolutely. Look, I'm tempted to say, I think we can push it a little further to the next 2-3 minutes. Any final thoughts at all from any of you based on this, you know, the questions, your own preparations, everything. So it maybe start with you, Ife.
So I would want to conclude and taking into account the importance of fisheries to millions of people on the African continent and paraphrase this quote that is credited to Admiral John Fisher in 1905. And it says, if we lose command of the sea, it is not invasion we must fear, but starvation. I mean, the reality is very much upon us for millions of people on the African continent. And unless our government do something radically different, this is really what is the reality for so many people in coastal communities across West and Central Africa and other parts of the African continent. Thank you.
Yeah, I would have wanted to be a bit more optimistic, but with the people that I work with, the nomadic people, and I think generally in the northern Kenya and the Horn of Africa, I think most of them feel that even the changes that are coming, even with the climate financing, the loss and damages, there's this famous book, literature piece written in Kenya in the, I think, 90s, 80s. They said it was better while we waited. Now we have, you know, the past is really gone and the future looks terrible. So sometimes that's why I think most of this, you know, our contribution and our research reflects how these communities feel. So even when we would like to bring these positive stories, we cannot fabricate them just to say that things are looking up. I know the conversations coming out of COP have brought about some sense of how groups are getting organized and, you know, different groups, you know, in solidarity, trying to piece the ideas together. But I think our work as community researchers is to continue amplifying the voices, but also even giving them space to amplify their own voice where it's possible. So I'm grateful for LC team and the Africa King's Africa Week to bring these voices on board and to think about the mobile and marginalized people as voice on this panel. Thank you so much.
That's fabulous. Really, I can't even thank you well enough. Dr. Ifesinachi Okafor-Yarwood and Rahma Hassan. It's been more than we asked for in terms of, you know, your expertise, your insights, but also the engagement from the audience, which has been superb. In fact, thanks. I can't even express it in words now, but thank you so much, panelists. We will continue this conversation. Like we said before, these very rich ideas, we would pick it up, repackage them into, you know, scholarly discussions, and then you know, we take it from there. So I'll be getting back in touch with you, panelists, on this. And audience, amazing. So many questions, so much engagement. Thanks so much. Huh? And I know we've exceeded the time we asked of you by 5 minutes, but we can't really ask for more anymore. Thanks so much, and do have a good day. And please continue to engage with Africa Week events. There are several activities happening, and we hope to see you there at some point. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.